She was a thing tied to a post. The rope at her wrists was coarse and bit into skin already chapped raw by wind and neglect. It had rubbed away the dirt in two pale bracelets against the grime that clung to her like a second, shameful skin. Her feet, bare against the hard-packed earth of the settlement's main thoroughfare, were cracked and bleeding. Dust, fine as ground bone, puffed around her ankles with every gust of a wind that had no kindness in it. She kept her eyes on the space between her own feet. To look up was to meet the gazes of the passers-by. There was the flat, bovine curiosity of the farmers, the sneering contempt of the saloon women in their faded finery, the cold assessment of the traders. Some spat. Others murmured, the words like stones pelting her bruised silence. Most just walked on, their indifference a heavier blow than any insult. She had learned that being invisible was not the same as being safe. It was simply being worthless. The man who owned the rope, a florid merchant named Silas whose sweat stained the collar of his shirt dark, paced before her. He gestured with a fat, ringed hand. He was talking about debts, about broken promises, and the hard price of business. She was the period at the end of his angry sentence. A piece of property to be liquidated. An object lesson. Across the dusty expanse, a man watched from the deep shade of the assayer's office. He was Comanche, that much was clear from the line of his jaw and the way he stood, still as a rock ledge while the world eddied around him. He wore no paint, only the sun-darkened mask of his own history. His clothes were practical, worn leggings, a simple buckskin shirt, moccasins that seemed a part of the earth they stood on. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that she, in her own desolation, recognized as a familiar country. His name was Cano, and he had come for salt and iron, not for the sorrow of others. Yet his gaze remained fixed on the woman at the post. He saw not the dirt or the rags, but the line of her spine. It was not broken. Bent, yes, but not broken. He saw the way she held her chin, angled just so, not in defiance but in a quiet, stubborn refusal to be completely erased. Silas's patience, thin as a gambler's smile, finally snapped. He grabbed the rope and gave it a sharp tug, forcing a choked gasp from the woman. Last chance, he boomed, his voice slick with impatience, addressing the listless crowd. Coin or credit? Or I take my payment and we're done here. Silence answered him, thick and suffocating. The wind died down as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then a movement. Cano pushed himself away from the wall. He did not hurry. Each step was deliberate, measured, stirring little dust. He walked into the unforgiving sunlight, his shadow trailing long and thin behind him. The crowd parted for him, a silent ripple of unease and respect. He stopped a few feet from Silas, his eyes not on the merchant, but on the woman. He saw the flicker of her gaze, a darting, terrified thing, before it returned to the ground. Silas squared his shoulders, trying to project an authority he did not feel. What do you want, Indian? Cano did not answer with words. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and drew out a stack of cured beaver pelts, thick and dark and lustrous. He laid them on an empty barrel between them. The pile was generous, more than a horse, more than the petty debt Silas was owed. The scent of pine and smoke and clean animal fur rose from them, a wild perfume in the stale air of the town. Silas's eyes, small and greedy, fixed on the furs. He ran a hand over his sweating jaw, the calculation plain on his face. This was more than he had hoped for. A clean profit. He glanced at the woman, then back at the pelts. She's damaged goods, Silas said, a last, pathetic attempt at haggling. Cano's expression did not change, but a coldness emanated from him that was more potent than any threat. He simply waited. With a grunting sigh, Silas untied the rope from the hitching post. He tossed the frayed end onto the dirt. She's yours. He scooped up the pelts, his movements quick and furtive as if he feared the offer might be rescinded. Cano ignored him. He walked the final few steps to the woman who flinched as his shadow fell over her. She stood frozen, a trapped animal waiting for the final blow. He did not reach for her. He did not speak. He drew a worn knife from a sheath at his hip. The blade was clean and sharp. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tremor running through her thin frame. She heard only a soft, sawing sound, a release of tension. The weight of the rope fell away from her hands. She opened her eyes. The rope lay in two pieces in the dust. Her wrists were free, stark and white and vulnerable. He sheathed his knife. His eyes met hers for a barest second. And in them, she saw nothing of ownership, nothing of lust. She saw only a vast, quiet sorrow, and something else beneath it, something like duty. He gave a single, small nod of his head toward the edge of town, where a sturdy pony stood waiting patiently. Then he turned and walked, not looking back to see if she followed. He did not command her. The choice, for the first time in a very long time, was hers. After a moment's hesitation that felt like a lifetime, her bare feet began to move. She followed the silent man out of the town that had unmade her, leaving the ghost of her humiliation tied to the post behind her. The journey was a long passage of silence. He rode, she walked. The sun beat down, turning the air to a shimmering haze. The dust lifted behind them like accusation, a pale shroud for the life she was leaving. He set a slow pace, the pony's hooves falling in a steady, rhythmic plod. Every so often he would glance back, his face unreadable, just a quick check to ensure she was still there. Once, when the sun was at its most punishing, he stopped. He dismounted and held out his water skin. She hesitated, her throat a knot of thirst and fear. His hand remained steady and offering without condition. Her fingers, trembling slightly, brushed his as she took it. The leather was warm from the sun, and the water inside was cool and tasted of earth and life. She drank, then handed it back. Their eyes did not meet. He took a swallow himself before mounting the pony again. It was the first act of kindness she had known in so long it felt like a dream. The land they moved through was as scarred and stark as she felt inside. Jagged mesas clawed at a pale, washout sky. The ground was cracked clay and rock, studded with thorny brush and the skeletal remains of yucca. It was a place that promised nothing. As dusk began to bleed purple and blood orange across the horizon, they arrived. His home was not a teepee in a bustling camp, but a solitary lodge of hide and weathered wood tucked into the curve of a small, life-giving creek. It stood alone, braced against the wind, looking as though it had grown from the earth itself. It was a place of deep and profound isolation. Near the lodge, a small plot of ground was marked by a single, smooth piece of wood driven into the soil. The earth around it was free of weeds, tended with a care that spoke of a grief still breathing. It was a grave. She understood then that his silence was not empty, it was filled with a name he no longer spoke. He slid from his pony and gestured for her to enter the lodge. The air inside was cool and smelled of smoke, sage, and something else, the faint, lingering scent of absence. It was meticulously clean but spare. A fire pit in the center, sleeping furs on one side, a few clay pots and baskets on the other. It was a space hollowed out by loss. He ladled a thick, savory stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her, along with a folded blanket. Then he moved to the far side of the fire pit, leaving the sleeping furs and the greater part of the lodge to her. He sat with his back against the wall, took out his knife, and began to sharpen the blade with a smooth stone. The rasp of steel on stone was the only sound. He did not close the entrance flap. He did not look at her. He was not her jailer. He was simply a man in his own house, and she was a stranger he had brought in from the wind. In the flickering firelight, she ate the stew, the first real food she'd had in days. Its warmth spread through her, a small, fragile seed of comfort. This was the unspoken contract. He would provide shelter, and he would not harm her. In return, she was expected only to exist. For now, it was more than enough. The days settled into a rhythm, quiet and unhurried as the creek that flowed past the lodge. Time was measured not by a clock but by the shifting angle of the sun and the needs of a life stripped down to its essentials. He would rise before dawn, a shadow detaching itself from the other shadows, and leave with his bow or his traps. She would wake to the silence he left behind, the lodge holding the faint warmth of his sleeping presence. While he was gone, she began, tentatively at first, to inhabit the space. She swept the hard-packed earth floor with a broom of bound twigs she made herself. The repetitive motion was calming, a small act of order in a world of chaos. He would return in the afternoon, sometimes with a rabbit or a brace of quail, which he would clean by the creek. He never asked her to help, but one day she took the birds from him and prepared them herself, her hands remembering old skills. She found wild onions and a pungent herb growing along the water and added them to the pot. That evening, as they ate, he looked into his bowl and then at her. He said nothing, but he ate every last bit. A week passed. Then another. He left a pair of moccasins by her sleeping furs. They were small, delicately beaded in a pattern of faded blue flowers. They were worn, but supple and strong. They belonged to the woman buried outside. She hesitated for a full day before trying them on. They fit as if made for her. When she wore them, the stony ground was kinder to her feet. It felt like a transgression, but also like a gift. She began to wander farther from the lodge, exploring the small, sheltered world of the creek bed. She learned the shapes of the rocks, the habits of the lizards that sunned themselves there. One afternoon, she found a single, stubborn wildflower pushing its way through a crack in a slab of stone. Its petals were the color of a faded sunset. She picked it and, her heart pounding, carried it to the small, tidy grave. She pushed its stem into the earth at the base of the wooden marker. When Kano returned, he saw it. He stopped and stood before the grave for a long time, his back to her. She watched from the lodge entrance, her breath caught in her throat, expecting anger. But when he finally turned, his face was like a stone smoothed by water, the sharpest edges of his grief worn away. That night, the silence between them felt different. Not heavy, but companionable. Shared. He began to leave things for her on the flat rock by the entrance, a hawk's feather with its intricate barring, a piece of quartz that caught the light, a bird's egg of a startling blue. They were not gifts that demanded thanks, but simple offerings. Statements of notice. I see you. In return, she began to hum. It started as a sound so low it was almost part of the wind's whisper, a broken melody from a half-forgotten life. Over the days, it grew stronger, clearer, a thin thread of music weaving itself into the fabric of their quiet life. One night, the past came for her. It came in a dream of rope and jeering faces and Silas's sweaty hands. She woke with a choked cry, sitting bolt upright, the blanket clutched to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Across the dim, glowing embers of the fire, Kano was already awake, sitting just as she had last seen him. He did not move closer. He did not offer empty comfort. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, a rock in the churning sea of her fear. You are safe here. The words settled over her, a blanket warmer than the one she held. The trembling in her limbs began to subside. In the fragile quiet that followed, a question rose from a place deep inside her, a question she had not dared to ask. Her voice was thin as a fence rail, rusty from disuse. Why? She whispered. Why did you take me? The silence stretched. The embers popped and hissed. She thought he would not answer. But then he spoke, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. The debt was not hers to pay. It was not an explanation of his heart, but of his principles. It was solid. It was real. And in that moment of stark, simple truth, the last of the ice around her own heart began to crack. She lay back down, but she did not sleep. She watched the steady silhouette of the man across the fire until the first gray light of dawn. And for the first time, she did not feel like a captive. She felt found. The first sign of the intrusion was a smudge of dust on the far horizon, a disturbance in the vast, empty canvas of the plains. Kano saw it first. He had been checking a line of snares on the ridge above the creek, and he went still, his body a study in taut vigilance. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into the shape of a single rider moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Not a lost traveler. This was a man with a destination. He returned to the lodge without haste, but with an economy of motion that spoke of urgency. She saw the change in him at once. The quiet peace of the morning was gone, replaced by a coiled tension. He did not need to speak. The wind itself seemed to turn mean, carrying a new chill. She watched from the entrance as he stood outside, a sentinel guarding their small patch of existence. The rider drew closer, becoming a man on a horse, a familiar figure from the settlement. One of Silas's men, a hired hand with shifty eyes and a perpetual slouch. The man reined in his horse a respectful distance from the lodge, clearly unnerved by Kano's silent, unmoving presence. He did not dismount. Got a message for the Indian, the man called out, his voice thin against the open space. He held up a folded piece of paper. From Silas. Kano did not move. He simply waited. The rider, shifting uncomfortably, continued. Silas, he sold the contract. On the girl, he nodded his head toward the lodge, not daring to look at her as she stood half-hidden in the shadows. Sold it to Mr. Croft. The rancher. Croft, he wants what he paid for. He says he's comin' to collect. The name Croft landed like a stone in the quiet air. He was a man known for his ruthlessness, a man who saw land and livestock and people as things to be broken and owned. The unspoken threat was clear. Croft was not a man who took no for an answer. The messenger tossed the paper onto the ground where it lay like a dead leaf. He'll be here in 2 days, he said, and without waiting for a reply, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, eager to be away. The dust of his departure hung in the air long after he was gone. The sanctuary was breached. The fragile peace they had built was shattered. Kano walked over and picked up the paper. He could not read the strange markings on it, but he understood its meaning. It was a claim. A piece of paper from a world that believed it could own a person's soul. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a gravity she had not seen before. He did not tell her to hide. He did not tell her to run. His look was a question. Do we stand, or do we flee? She met his gaze, and for the first time there was no fear in her own. There was a cold, hard resolve. She had been running, in one way or another, her whole life. She would not run anymore. She gave a single, sharp nod. Cano held the paper for a moment longer, then he walked to the fire pit and dropped it into the flames. They watched together as the edges curled, turned black, and vanished into smoke and ash. The law of men had been rendered meaningless. Now only the law of the land remained. 2 days later they came. The sun was hot and high, bleaching the color from the sky. 3 riders crested the ridge, their forms dark against the shimmering heat. They moved with the slow, arrogant swagger of men who believed the world belonged to them. Croft was in the lead, a big man on a big horse, his face burned red by the sun and whiskey. His 2 hired men flanked him, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. They rode down into the small valley and stopped before the lodge, their horses stamping and blowing in the sudden quiet. Cano was waiting. He stood alone in the open space between the intruders and the lodge entrance, his posture relaxed but rooted to the earth. His hands were empty, but the hatchet at his belt was a silent, deadly promise. "I'm here for the girl, Indian," Croft said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He did not bother with pleasantries. He looked past Cano, trying to peer into the shadowed doorway. Cano's voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it carried with absolute clarity. "She is not a thing to be taken." Croft let out a short, ugly laugh. "I have a paper. Says she's mine. Bought and paid for." He patted a pocket on his coat. "Now you can step aside and live, or you can stay put and die. Makes no difference to me." As he spoke, a movement came from the lodge. She stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh sunlight. She did not shrink or cower. She walked to Cano's side, placing herself beside him, not behind him. In her hands she held the heavy, black cast-iron skillet, its weight a solid and reassuring presence. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a fire that burned away all traces of the broken thing she had once been. Croft's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in anger at the sight of her defiance. "Get back inside, girl," he barked, his authority challenged. "This is business between men." She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. And then she spoke. The voice that came from her was not the thin, reedy whisper he might have expected. It was clear and cold as the water in the creek. "No." The word, a single syllable of pure refusal, hung in the tense air. It was a declaration. An act of rebellion so profound it shifted the balance of power. Croft's face contorted with rage. To be defied by the Indian was one thing, to be defied by his property was an intolerable insult. He swung his leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground, his spurs jingling with menace. "I'll drag you out of here myself," he snarled, taking a step forward. In that instant, Cano moved. It was not a large movement, just a fluid shift of weight, but it was electric with lethal intent. The hatchet was suddenly in his hand, held low and ready. But Croft's focus was on her. As he lunged, raising a hand to grab her arm, she acted. She did not scream. She did not retreat. She swung the heavy skillet in a clean, powerful arc. There was a sickening, wet crack as iron met bone. Croft howled, a raw sound of pain and shock, and stumbled back, clutching his arm. It hung at an unnatural angle. His face was a mask of disbelief. His 2 men who had been watching with confident smirks were frozen in place. Their confidence evaporated, replaced by the stark realization of their situation. They faced a silent Comanche warrior who looked as if he had been born for this very moment, and a woman who had just shattered their boss's arm with a piece of cookware. This was not the easy work they had been paid for. Their nerve broke. Without a word to each other, they moved to help the whimpering, cursing Croft back onto his horse. He slumped in the saddle, pale with pain. They threw one last, hateful look at the 2 figures standing unmoving before the lodge, then turned their horses and fled, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust and fading threats. The dust settled. The sudden, violent noise faded, and the silence that rushed back in to fill the void was different. It was not empty. It was a silence that was earned, a silence full of victory and the deep, resonant hum of shared survival. They stood together for a long moment, the man and the woman side by side in the glaring sun. Cano looked from the retreating riders to her. His gaze fell to the skillet, which she still held in a white-knuckled grip. A change occurred in his eyes, a subtle softening like frost melting from a winter windowpane. It was not a smile, but it was close. He reached out and gently took the heavy skillet from her hands, which had begun to tremble now that the danger was past. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, warm contact. He set the skillet down on the ground. That night, the fire in the pit seemed to burn brighter. The air in the lodge felt warmer, charged with the unsaid things that now lay between them. They ate their meal in the new, comfortable quiet. When they were done, he did not retreat to his side of the lodge. He remained by the fire, feeding it small sticks. They called you girl, he said, his voice low, directed into the flames. It is not a name. He paused and she waited, knowing this was important. My wife, her name was Nima, he said, the name leaving his lips for what felt like the first time in an age. It means the moon. She was quiet light in the darkness. He looked up from the fire, his eyes finding hers in the flickering gloom. You are not the moon. You are the fire that held back the dark. He held her gaze, and in that look she felt seen, truly and completely, perhaps for the first time in her life. I will call you Tawa, he said. The word was soft, but it landed with the weight of a stone truth. It means the sun. The name was a key, unlocking a part of her she thought had died. Tears began to well in her eyes, hot and unstoppable. They were not the tears of grief or fear she had known before. They were tears of shattering relief, of being found, of being given a self. She wept, silent sobs shaking her frame, and Kano did not touch her, did not offer platitudes. He simply sat there, a steadfast guardian, his presence a shield bearing witness until the storm passed and she was calm again. In the days that followed, the world was remade. The lodge was no longer a shelter, it was a home. The unspoken contract of survival was replaced by an unspoken covenant of partnership. He began to teach her words in his language, the names of the birds, the plants, the winds. She taught him, without words, the quiet resilience of a flower that blooms in scorched earth. One morning, Kano gathered the 2 pieces of frayed rope he had cut from her wrists weeks before. He had kept them tucked away in a corner of the lodge. He took them to the fire and, with Tawa watching, he dropped them in. They watched as the fibers blackened, twisted, and became nothing more than fine, gray ash carried away on the smoke. A life of bondage incinerated. A past unwritten. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. A week later, he took a piece of smooth hide and, using charcoal from the fire, drew 2 figures. One tall, one a little shorter, standing side by side, facing a rising sun. He hung it on the lodge wall. It was the first piece of adornment, the first thing in the lodge that was not purely for survival. It was for memory. It was for them. The house began to breathe again. The final image of them is one of late autumn. They sat together on a worn bench outside the lodge, watching the last of the sun's light paint the mesas in strokes of gold and deep violet. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and coming frost. She was stitching a new shirt for him from soft deer hide, her movements sure and practiced. He was carving a small wooden bird, his knife moving with a quiet, focused grace. A silence rested between them, easy and deep as a river pool. It was not empty. It was full of everything that mattered. Full of a shared past and a slowly dawning future. The small, isolated lodge was no longer a place of grief and absence. It was the center of the world. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It isn't about a strong man saving a helpless woman. It's about what happens after. It's about the slow, patient work of healing. It's about 2 broken souls who, in the vast and unforgiving quiet of the world, found the missing pieces of themselves in each other. A name, you see, is more than a word. It's a recognition. It's someone looking at the core of you and giving it a voice. Tawa. The sun. He didn't just give her a name, he gave her back her own light. And safety. Safety isn't just 4 walls and a roof. It's the steady presence of a person who will stand with you, who will place themselves between you and the dark, not because they have to, but because their soul demands it. We all have a wilderness inside us, a place scarred by loss or cruelty. We walk through it, sometimes for years, thinking we are alone. But this story is a reminder. It's a quiet promise whispered on the wind that even in the harshest lands, something beautiful can grow. That a home is not a place you find on a map, but a truth you find in another's eyes. And if you are brave enough to stand your ground, if you are kind enough to offer water to the thirsty, and if you are open enough to be truly seen, you might just find that you are not building a shelter from the storm. You are the shelter. You are the home. And you were never, ever alone.